Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, let me take you back to that evening, a night that started like any other but ended in a way I could never have imagined. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the air smells faintly of wood smoke and fallen leaves. The party was at our friend's house, a cozy home nestled in the woods just outside town. My husband Greg and I had been looking forward to it for weeks. At 58, I've come to enjoy these gatherings more than ever, less about the noise, more about the connections, the laughter, and the warmth of familiar faces. Greg had been unusually quiet that afternoon as we got ready. He's a man of few words, but there was something in the way he adjusted his tie in the mirror, his fingers fumbling slightly, that made me pause. "Everything okay?" I asked, smoothing the hem of my emerald green dress, a favorite of his, though I didn't wear it often. "Yeah," he said, flashing me that half smile of his, the one that always made me feel like he was keeping a secret. "Just thinking." I didn't press him. After 35 years of marriage, I've learned to read his silences. Sometimes, they're heavy, but this one felt different, lighter, almost like something exciting was coming. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. By the time we arrived, the party was in full swing. The house was alive with conversation, the clink of glasses, and soft jazz playing in the background. Our friends, Susan and Tom, greeted us at the door with warm hugs. Glasses of wine in hand, Susan's eyes sparkled as she leaned in to whisper, "I think you're going to enjoy tonight." I raised an eyebrow, curious, but she just smiled and disappeared into the crowd. Greg squeezed my hand, his palm warm against mine, and led me into the living room. The space was bathed in the golden glow of string lights, and the air was filled with the scent of spiced cider and something sweet baking in the oven. It felt like stepping into a storybook. We mingled for a while, catching up with old friends and making small talk with acquaintances. Greg stayed close, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back, a quiet reassurance. But every now and then, I'd catch him glancing at me, his expression unreadable. It was as if he was waiting for something, though I couldn't imagine what. Then, around 9 o'clock, Susan clinked a spoon against her glass, calling for everyone's attention. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she said, her voice warm and steady. "We have a little surprise for you, or rather, Greg does." My heart skipped a beat. Greg's surprises weren't exactly his style. I turned to him, but he was already stepping forward, his hand slipping from my back. He looked nervous, his shoulders tense, but there was a determination in his eyes that made my breath catch. He cleared his throat, his voice wavering slightly. "I've been thinking a lot lately about how lucky I am, how lucky we are," he said, his gaze finding mine. I felt a lump rise in my throat. 35 years is a long time, and yet it feels like no time at all. You've been my rock, my partner, my best friend. And tonight, I wanted to do something to show you just how much you mean to me." The room was completely silent now, every eye fixed on him. My pulse quickened as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, his hands trembling just enough for me to notice. Then he began to read. It was a letter, a love letter, though that word doesn't fully capture its depth. He spoke of moments I'd long forgotten, little things I'd done over the years that had meant the world to him. The way I'd held his hand during his father's funeral, the way I'd laughed at his terrible jokes even when no one else did, the way I'd always believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, including mine. I felt exposed, raw, as if he had peeled back my soul and laid it bare for everyone to see. But more than that, I felt seen. Truly, deeply seen. He folded the letter and slipped it back into his pocket, his eyes never leaving mine. "I love you," he said simply, his voice steady now, "and I wanted everyone here to know." The room erupted into applause, but I barely heard it. All I could see was Greg standing there with his heart in his hands, waiting for me to respond. I stepped forward, my own hands trembling as I reached for his. "I love you too," I whispered, my voice breaking more than words can say. He pulled me into his arms, and for a moment, the rest of the world faded away. It was just the two of us standing there in the middle of that crowded room, holding on to each other like we were the only two people who mattered. When we finally pulled apart, the room was buzzing with conversation, but I barely noticed. My mind was still reeling, trying to process what had just happened. Greg had always been a man of action, not words. He showed his love in quiet ways: a cup of coffee brought to me in bed, a hand on my shoulder when I was stressed, a kiss on the forehead before he left for work. But this was something entirely new. As the night wore on, I found myself stealing glances at him, trying to reconcile the man I thought I knew with the one who had just bared his soul in front of all our friends. There was a softness in his eyes now, a vulnerability that made my heart ache in the best possible way. By the time we left the party, the moon was high in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the trees. Greg held my hand as we walked to the car, his fingers laced tightly through mine. Neither of us spoke, but the silence between us was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that comes from decades of shared life. As we drove home, I found myself replaying the evening in my mind. Every moment was clear as day. I remembered the way Greg's voice had cracked when he read the letter, how his hands trembled, and the way he looked at me, as if I were the only person in the room. It was a night I knew I'd never forget, a night that had changed something deep between us. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. There was more to come, more to discover, more to feel. For the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of excitement and a sense of anticipation for what the future might hold. Little did I know, the real surprise was still to come. The morning light filtered through the curtains, soft and golden, as I stirred awake. Greg was already up, his side of the bed cool to the touch. I lay there for a moment, the events of the previous night replaying in my mind like a vivid dream: the letter, the way he looked at me, the room holding its breath. It all felt surreal, yet undeniably real. I found Greg in the kitchen, standing by the window with a cup of coffee in his hands. He was still in his pajamas, his hair slightly disheveled, and there was a quiet stillness in his posture that made me pause. He turned when he heard me enter, and his face broke into a warm smile. "Morning," he said, his voice soft. "Morning," I replied, crossing the room to pour myself a cup of coffee. The rich aroma filled the air, grounding me in the familiarity of our morning routine. But as I leaned against the counter, sipping my mug, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. The air felt charged with an unspoken tension, a quiet anticipation neither of us knew how to address. "How are you feeling?" Greg asked after a moment, his eyes searching mine. I hesitated, unsure how to put my emotions into words. "Overwhelmed," I admitted finally. "In a good way, though. Last night was beautiful, Greg. I don't think I've ever felt so loved." He nodded, his expression softening. "I meant every word," he said quietly. I wanted you to know. To really know." I set my mug down and crossed the room to stand beside him. The sunlight streaming through the window caught the gray in his hair, and for a moment, I was struck by how much he had changed over the years, yet how much he had stayed the same. "I do know," I said, reaching for his hand. "And I love you for it." He squeezed my hand, his grip firm and reassuring, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, maybe even fear, that made me pause. "What is it?" I asked gently. he sighed, running a hand through his hair. I hope I didn't embarrass you last night. I know it was a lot, and I didn't mean to put you on the spot like that. I shook my head, a soft laugh escaping my lips. You didn't embarrass me, Greg. You surprised me, yes, but in the best possible way. It was perfect. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Good, he said, though I could tell there was more he wasn't saying. I wanted to press him to ask what was really on his mind, but I knew better. Greg had always been a man who needed time to process his thoughts, and I had learned over the years to give him the space he needed. We spent the rest of the morning in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from years of shared routines. He made breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, just the way I liked them, and we ate at the kitchen table, the sunlight streaming through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. It was a quiet, ordinary morning, but it felt anything but ordinary. Later, as I was clearing the dishes, Greg disappeared into the study. I could hear him rummaging around, drawers opening and closing, and I wondered what he was up to, but I didn't ask. Instead, I busied myself with the laundry, folding clothes and trying to shake the feeling that something was still unresolved between us. It wasn't until later that afternoon that Greg finally emerged from the study, holding a small, leather-bound notebook. The pages were worn and dog-eared from years of use. I recognized it immediately. It was the journal he had started keeping after his father passed away, a place where he'd written down his thoughts and memories over the years. I want to show you something, he said, his voice hesitant but determined. He sat down on the couch, patting the space beside him. I joined him, my curiosity piqued. He opened the journal to a page near the middle, his fingers trembling slightly as he smoothed the paper. I've been writing in this for years, he said, his voice low. Mostly just random thoughts, things I wanted to remember. But lately, I've been writing about you. I felt my breath catch in my throat as he began to read. The words were raw and unfiltered, a stream of consciousness that painted a picture of our life together in vivid detail. He wrote about the way I laughed, the way I hummed to myself when I thought no one was listening, the way I held his hand during the darkest moments of his life. He wrote about the little things, the way I always stole the covers, how I'd leave little notes for him around the house, the way I'd kiss him goodbye even when we were mad at each other. By the time he finished, I was crying, the tears streaming down my face as I struggled to process the depth of his words. Greg, I whispered, my voice breaking. I had no idea. He closed the journal and set it aside, his eyes meeting mine. I've always been better at writing things down than saying them out loud, he admitted. But last night made me realize that I don't want to keep these things to myself anymore. I want you to know how much you mean to me, every single day. I reached for his hand, my fingers intertwining with his. You've always shown me, I said softly, in 1,000 little ways. But this is something else. He smiled, a real smile this time, and pulled me into his arms. We sat there for a long time, holding each other as the afternoon light faded into evening. It was a moment of quiet intimacy, a moment of connection that felt deeper than anything we had shared before. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in shadows, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to come. Greg had opened a door, and I had a feeling that what lay on the other side would change us in ways we couldn't yet imagine. Revelation at the party and the morning after were filled with a quiet intensity. It was as if a veil had been lifted between us, revealing layers of emotion and connection that had always been there but had never been fully acknowledged. We moved through our routines with a newfound awareness of each other, our gestures more deliberate, our conversations more meaningful. Yet there was still an undercurrent of something unspoken, something Greg seemed to be holding back. It was a Thursday evening when the next chapter of this unfolding story began. Greg had been unusually restless all day, pacing the house and glancing at the clock as if waiting for something. I'd asked him if everything was okay, but he just smiled and said, "You'll see." His cryptic response deepened my curiosity, but I decided to let it go, trusting that he'd share when he was ready. After dinner, he disappeared into the study again, emerging a few minutes later with a small, neatly wrapped box in his hands. He sat down beside me on the couch, his expression a mix of nervousness and excitement. "I've been thinking a lot about what I said at the party," he began, his voice steady but soft. "And I realized that words, even written ones, can only go so far. So I wanted to give you something tangible." He handed me the box, his eyes never leaving mine. I took it carefully, my fingers trembling slightly as I untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet, its surface engraved with a series of dates and words. I held it up to the light, my breath catching as I realized what it was. "These are all the moments that have meant the most to me," Greg explained, his voice thick with emotion. "The day we met, the day we got married, the day we bought this house, and all the little moments in between. I wanted you to have something you could carry with you, something that would remind you of how much you mean to me." I felt the tears welling up in my eyes as I traced the engravings with my fingertips. Each date, each word was a piece of our story, a testament to the life we built together. "Greg," I whispered, my voice breaking. It's perfect." He smiled, a soft, tender smile that made my heart ache. "Here, let me help you put it on," he said, taking the bracelet from my hands and fastening it around my wrist. The metal felt cool against my skin, but the weight of it was comforting, a constant reminder of his love. We sat there for a long time, my head resting on his shoulder as we talked about the memories etched into the bracelet. He told me stories I'd never heard before, little moments he cherished over the years that I hadn't even realized had meant so much to him. It was like seeing our life together through his eyes, and it filled me with a deep sense of gratitude and wonder. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more he wasn't telling me. There was a tension in the air, a quiet anticipation that made my heart race. Finally, I turned to him and asked, "Greg, is there something else? Something you're not saying?" He hesitated, his eyes searching mine as if trying to gauge whether I was ready to hear what he had to say. Then, with a deep breath, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I've been working on this for a while," he said, his voice trembling slightly. It's a letter, but not like the one I read at the party. This one is different." I took the paper from him, my hands shaking as I unfolded it. The words were written in his familiar handwriting, but there was a rawness to them that made my chest tighten. He'd written about his fears, his regrets, the moments he felt he'd failed me or let me down. He wrote about the weight of his love for me, how it sometimes felt overwhelming, how he worried he wasn't enough. And then, at the end, he wrote something that took my breath away. "I've spent my life trying to be the man you deserve," he'd written. "But lately, I've realized that maybe it's not about being enough. Maybe it's about being honest, about letting you see all of me, the good, the bad, the messy parts. Because I know now that you're the only person who's ever truly seen me. And I want to do the same for you." I looked up at him, tears streaming down my face. "Greg," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You've always been enough. More than enough." He reached for my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "I know that now," he said softly. "But I needed to say it. I needed you to know." We sat there for a long time, holding each other as the weight of his words settled over us. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, a moment of connection that felt deeper than anything we'd shared before. And as I looked at him, really looked at him, I realized that this was what love was, not perfection, but honesty, not grand gestures, but the courage to be seen. Later that night, as we lay in bed, I found myself tracing the engravings on the bracelet, each date and word a reminder of the life we built together. Greg's breathing was slow and steady beside me, his hand resting lightly on my arm. I felt a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that whatever came next, we'd face it together. But even as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. There was still more to come, more to discover, more to feel. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready for whatever it was. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet moments and shared revelations. Greg and I moved through our days with a newfound sense of closeness, as if the walls we hadn't even realized were there had finally come down. The bracelet on my wrist became a constant reminder of the love we'd built, the memories we'd shared, and the honesty we'd found in each other. Yet there was still a part of me that felt like we were standing on the edge of something even bigger, something neither of us could fully see yet. It was a Saturday evening when the final piece of this journey fell into place. Greg had been acting strangely all day, fidgeting with his phone and glancing at me with a look I couldn't quite decipher. When he finally cleared his throat and said, "I have a surprise for you," I felt my heart skip a beat. His surprises had become something I both anticipated and feared, not because I didn't trust him, but because they always seemed to unlock a part of me I hadn't known was there. "What kind of surprise?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light even as my pulse quickened. He smiled that half smile of his that always made me feel like he was keeping a secret. "You'll see," he said, taking my hand and leading me to the car. We drove in silence, the hum of the engine filling the space between us. I stole glances at him as he focused on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. There was a calmness about him now, a quiet confidence that made me feel safe even as my curiosity grew. When we pulled into the parking lot of a small, unassuming dance studio, I turned to him, confused. "A dance studio?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He nodded, his smile widening. "I've been taking lessons," admitted, his voice tinged with both pride and nervousness. "I wanted to surprise you." I stared at him, my mind racing. Greg had never been much of a dancer. In fact, he'd always been the kind of man who preferred to stay on the sidelines at weddings, clapping along while others took to the floor. The idea of him taking dance lessons was so far out of character that I couldn't quite process it. "Why?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached for my hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "Because I wanted to do something for you," he said simply. "Something that would show you how much you mean to me. And because I wanted to dance with you." I felt the tears welling up in my eyes as I looked at him, really looked at him. This man, who had spent his life showing his love in quiet, steady ways, was now stepping so far out of his comfort zone, all for me. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. We walked into the studio together, the sound of soft music drifting through the air. The room was empty except for a single instructor, a woman in her 50s with a warm smile and a no-nonsense demeanor. She greeted us with a nod and gestured to the center of the room. "Ready?" Greg asked, his voice tinged with both excitement and nervousness. I nodded, my heart pounding as he led me to the center of the floor. The instructor put on a slow, melodic song, and Greg took my hand, his other hand resting lightly on my waist. For a moment, we just stood there, looking at each other, the weight of everything we'd been through hanging in the air between us. And then, we began to dance. It was awkward at first, our movements hesitant and unsure. But as the music swelled around us, something shifted. Greg's steps became more confident, his grip on my hand firmer, his eyes never leaving mine. It was as if the rest of the world faded away, leaving just the two of us, moving together in perfect harmony. I don't know how long we danced, minutes, hours, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the way he looked at me, the way his hands felt on mine, the way our bodies moved together as if we'd been doing this our whole lives. It was a moment of pure connection, a moment of love so profound it took my breath away. When the music finally faded, we stood there, holding each other, our breaths coming in sync. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice breaking. "For everything." He smiled, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I love you," he said simply. "And I wanted you to know that I'll always be here. Always trying. Always learning. Always growing with you." I felt the tears streaming down my face as I pulled him into a tight embrace. In that moment, I realized that this was what love was, not just the grand gestures or the quiet moments, but the willingness to grow together, to be vulnerable, to keep showing up day after day, year after year. As we drove home that night, the silence between us was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that comes from decades of shared life. I traced the engravings on my bracelet, each date and word a reminder of the journey we'd been on, the love we'd built, and the future we still had ahead of us. And as I looked at Greg, really looked at him, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that whatever came next, we'd face it together. Because that's what love is, not perfection, but partnership, not grand gestures, but the courage to keep dancing, even when the steps are unfamiliar.